Hello and welcome to our virtual panel on cannabis and law reform. I'm Lester from Cannabis Wiki, and with me today is our astute panel, and I'm going to pass it to our panel for them to introduce themselves. So we will start with Abby.
Hi, everyone. My name is Abigail Sampson. Thank you so much for joining in. I use she, her pronouns. Yeah, you know what? It's funny when I read the description of the event. It said, you know, veterans in the cannabis space, and I'm like, who are they talking about? I mean, is that me? But with that being said, I mean, I have been in the cannabis space for 5 years now. I started my cannabis career as a volunteer, actually. At NORML Canada. I'll let Caryma talk more about that. And that has brought me to do a lot of really amazing things in the cannabis space. I was able to speak at the House of Commons on Bill C-45 prior to legalization. I do a lot of cannabis advocacy work in my hometown here in Pickering. I'll get more into that during our conversation, I'm sure. But currently I sit on the board of directors of Niche Canada, which is the National Institute of Cannabis Health and Education. We advocate for, policy-based, facts-based education and engagement. And I also sit on the board of directions of the Dandelion Initiative, which is a not-for-profit organization that advocates for survivors of sexual assault violence. And I am very happy to be here.
Caryma.
Hi, everyone, and I will echo Abby's thanks for joining us on today's discussion. I am a lawyer, and I practice in the areas of criminal, housing, and cannabis law, and I'm currently the executive director at NORML Canada. And NORML, for those who may not know, is an organization that has campaigned for the elimination of criminal and civil penalties for private cannabis use. And since legalization, we're focusing on ensuring that we have a framework of law and policy that is functional, that works for consumers and non-consumers alike. And we're also interested in making sure that there is justice for those who were affected by criminalization.
Excellent. And last but not least, Ish.
Thank you. Hey everyone, thanks for coming. My name's Aderonmu. My relationship with cannabis goes back to grade 9 when I tried it for the first time in some suburban basement in suburban Philadelphia. And I guess my advocacy comes from personal experience. So I got into the cannabis business a little early, shall we say, in Philadelphia, and the police thought differently of my entrepreneurial spirit. And so I ended up back in Canada, not on my own 2 feet, and I start law school in the fall at Ryerson's inaugural class. Why am I here? Well, because I got in a lot of trouble for selling a plant that I can now get delivered to me via an app to my apartment right now.
Well said, well said. So everybody, this is our panel. I am so happy to be here. I'm actually privileged to be here with these guys. It's a vast amount of information that's going to be passed to you guys. So all the guests that are here and those that are going to tune in now and later, please, we're going to have a Q&A at the end of some questions that these guys are going to get into, and we're going to have a great conversation. So I'm going to start off. Is it safe to say that legalizing is misleading? I'm going to let this panel get into it with a few questions, and then we'll get into a Q&A. So guys, we're going to start off with question number 1. How do you feel about the legal system right now as it relates to cannabis?
Well, so the people that were, trailblazers that risked freedom and fought for this, plant, this to be able to be used and not criminalized, unfortunately are, sort of boxed out of the game now. And I think there's certainly initiatives, like I know in LA, the Cannabis the overseer of cannabis licenses has a specific initiative to target, racialized communities specifically, not just any racialized, but specific communities that were hit hard by the war on drugs in order to try to rectify that. And I think that should be just the starting point, not some ancillary thing they're doing.
So, I mean, I have mixed feelings about the legal system right now, but I'll start with the good. Not too long ago, when COVID-19 first hit, cannabis was deemed an essential service, when less than 2 years ago, cannabis was illegal federally. We can walk into a store now and get cannabis flower and drinks and gummies and chocolate and breath mints, vape cartridges, seeds. I can get all those, as Ish mentioned earlier, I can get all those things delivered to my door. Right. Legally, which is, I mean, that's kind of always been the case, but now the government has said it's okay to do that. And that's funny because at one of the last Pickering City Council meetings I attended this year, one of the city councilors actually advocated for increased law enforcement on these weed on wheels delivery services. Because apparently you can get it on an app and whatnot now. And, you know, he didn't feel it was safe that all these cars were driving around with cannabis. And lo and behold, now there are all these cars driving around with cannabis. It's just kind of a stamp, like it's a stamp that says cannabis is here. So that's been really neat. But of course, you know, I don't feel great about, you know, patient access, right? Even though cannabis is readily available recreationally at the retail front, patients still need to order their products online or over the phone. It still needs to be delivered to a fixed address. It needs to be purchased in certain quantities. Not all products that were available on the recreational market were readily available to patients right away. And then, of course, there's the tax thing. You know, medical cannabis is still taxed. So I have a lot of feelings, and we have a lot of work to do. Yeah.
Excellent. Caryma.
Just picking up on some of these threads, it is sort of surreal to now be in the world of legalization, and where things that were previously unfathomable, I'm walking down the street and I'm smoking a joint and I pass a cop and I'm not trying to hide the joint or drop it in a bush, or I'm just sort of going about my business. So like that I suppose is a nice change, and you know, we hopefully we just continue to progress from here. But as we progress and go further ahead, I am really mindful that there are groups being left behind, and many of these groups are the same ones who, as Ish pointed out, were the people risking their freedom to get us here to a legalized state. So that disconnect I find really problematic, and I think it's someplace that we have a responsibility to hold the government accountable and ensure that this doesn't just become a cash grab for a small handful of people who then, you know, sort of find the next shiny thing that they go off and play with. Like, this is a vibrant industry. It's been a vibrant industry, and the people who built it should be the ones sort of reaping those rewards.
Right, exactly. So at the very beginning, they talked about expungement, and they talked about pardons. They actually offered free pardons. So currently the Canadian government is only offering record suspensions as opposed to actual expungement records. Do you think this is fair?
I don't really think it's fair, and the difference between the two is actually quite significant. And you know, what's being offered is sort of a small piecemeal approach that affects a very small subset of the population that's dealt with cannabis convictions. So I don't think it's far enough.
I agree with everything Caryma just said, and I'll just add, the way I think about it is, this is, you know, certainly applies to Canada, but especially in the States. There are people doing time still for cannabis convictions, right? Mm-hmm. And some people that are doing like life, right? And meanwhile, there's, tractor trailer loads of weed, going. So the challenge that I have is, I think that's something that needs to be acknowledged. Like, if we're saying it's not the boogeyman, like we said it was, let's think about what to do about that, right? And that's something that I've been sort of personally working on, is trying to figure out what those numbers look like, in Canada, who's in there, and what we can do about it. Because I think that's super important, right? Because I would be kind of upset if I was sitting in a jail and I'm hearing that, weed is legal, and, you're reading the, Financial Times, and there's stocks about weed. And you're like, wow, I got locked up for this 10 years ago. This is insane.
And what about you, Abby, offering record suspensions opposed to actual expungement records?
Yeah, it's I think it's really funny that a government would go through like the entire process, like the entire legalization process, like conducting roundtables, bringing in like legal or bringing in experts from around the world, subject matter experts, enacting regulations, going down all of those steps, and then establishing legal enterprise. And yet there's still folks with like criminal records for like slinging dime bags or processing shatter, when these are all things that are legally being done now. It doesn't make sense that once upon a time these things were bad and these people were bad, and now we're in a place where it's good, so these people and this industry is good. So no, I don't think it's fair.
So then, do you think the scope of who is eligible for a record suspension should be widened?
Currently, who is like and I guess maybe I should step back for a second. I mentioned that there's a distinction between the two, and I didn't really touch on what that distinction is. But an expungement is essentially the government wiping and forgiving a past conviction, acknowledging we were wrong, this shouldn't have been illegal, our mistake. In contrast to a record suspension, where it's removed from your criminal record, it's suspended, but you're not forgiven per se of that offense. It still exists, it's still accessible, so it's not like a full solution. And currently, who's eligible for the pardon? If you have a conviction for simple possession. So that is probably like the smallest subset of people with cannabis convictions. Maybe not smallest in terms of absolute numbers, but it's the most minor of offenses. And something kind of like trafficking could actually have meant passing a friend a joint. But if you got convicted of trafficking, you wouldn't be eligible for this pardon. So when I say that it's a beneficial to a very small group, I think at last count there were just around 100 people in Canada who have taken advantage of this. So that's not like an effective program in that sense.
And you're talking about taking advantage of the pardon, whereas the expungement, correct?
Correct, because there is no expungement available. Like an example of expungement is people who were caught up in sort of backhouse raids or convicted for having relations like that got expunged. And it was the government saying, we never should have been prosecuting you for your sexual orientation. But that reckoning has not happened with cannabis.
Why do you guys think that is?
Probably there's an element of stigma there. And I think we would be remiss in not pointing out that although cannabis is consumed across racial groups sort of in equal amounts, in equal proportions, those who actually faced the most enforcement and criminalization and arrests and convictions are Black people, Indigenous people, people of color. So when you have that mental association of cannabis crime, who are these criminals? We're talking a very specific demographic that was targeted and suffered the most. And unfortunately, as far as politicians are concerned, on a lower priority scale than some of the other matters they decide to deal with. So I think that's at least a component of why the landscape is the way it is.
Abby, what can you add to that, or are you in full agreement of what Caryma's put on the table here?
Oh, I definitely agree with what Caryma has to say. And I'll also elaborate maybe because, I mean, like if we're talking about who's eligible for a record suspension, as Caryma mentioned, it's just folks who were charged with simple possession, right? Not like folks who may have been, as Caryma said, passing a joint to somebody else, that would be considered trafficking. While we have, once again, retail outlets with really fancy displays and I don't know. It's just like it's like an unequal application of justice. You know, like we're in a time now where, once again, large corporations are producing cannabis at scale, and we've still got folks whose lives have been essentially ruined by, you know, these cannabis convictions. I know we'll talk about it a little bit later, but the ramifications of criminalization is drastic. So I don't think a record suspension is enough.
Now, can I ask, I'm not sure which one of you want to take this question, and I'm not trying to go too far, but it's something I don't know. What is, or is there a limit of what they would charge for possession? Like, is it over 30 grams? Would you get charged for possession? Because right now we're legally able to have 30 grams. Now, if I per se had 31, 32 grams, is that a charge for possession? And what is the limit of possession? Is it 1 pound, 5 pounds, 50 pounds? Can any of you answer that one?
I just want to point out that it's funny we even have to have this conversation because we have legalized cannabis and yet have still created a system of rules that are kind of easy to break because it's confusing and that sets people up for failure. So I just, you know, as an aside, I think that it's sort of funny we're talking about possession. I could go to the LCBO and buy all of the stock and no one can say anything, right?
Right.
But to answer, currently under the Cannabis Act, for adults, 30 grams is the maximum amount you're allowed to have in public. Anything beyond that, and you could theoretically be charged. And you know, there's an element of discretion there. Discretion, as we know, is not evenly applied across the board. I will say that if you are a youth and you have more than 5 grams of cannabis, that becomes a criminal offense. So it's not a ticketable issue. It becomes a criminal matter that needs to be dealt with. And as to what you're allowed to have at home, that amount is unlimited. But if I am sort of traveling from one place to the next, you better go in batches of 30.
Okay, excellent. All right, so even with your cannabis record set aside, what kind of difficulties can one encounter? Ish.
Can one encounter, you mean just trying to get a pardon or?
Yes.
Sure. Well, one, you know, like you have to understand, you know, how to do it. You have to have, you know, you might need access to help. It doesn't factor into disabilities, anything like that. But beyond that, I think that if I could just back up a little bit and sort of speak, you know, truth to why it is the way it is, why, as Caryma said, it's there are so many rules, it's like kind of makes it hard to follow and easier to break the law. because of who was at the table when these decisions were being made, right? Because if there were people at the table that said, listen, like, if we're going to do this, we're going to legalize it, we're going to say that it's no longer bad. Okay, let's take a look. Mr. Bill Blair could go and look at the list of people that have any sort of cannabis conviction, trafficking, it doesn't matter, whatever it is. And if that's it, we're going to take those and we're going to destroy those records. We're going to, like Cannabis Amnesty thinks, right? Like they advocate for. What's the point? Like, it just get rid of the records, right? But it's by design this way, right? Like, why, that doesn't make sense. They want, the money and the people behind the industry and the people moving the gears and lobbying government, that doesn't really pay for them. The old system makes sense, right? Mm-hmm. Kind of like Reagan's sort of, I think it was Reagan or, one of those presidents, his domestic policy guy, basically, the paraphrase says, let's, blame the cannabis and the boogie on the blacks and the browns. And we'll get the general audience to think it's this terrible, bad thing. And one more thing I wanted to add is I find it really interesting when people that are in the cannabis game now kind of like talk bad about the black market and people like legacy folks, because I think that's really, at best, out of touch to, to cast aspersions in terms of like whether it's safe or not with people that are growing the plant versus some corporate for-profit machine. And we know this in other industries that like they don't have consumers' interests for the most part at heart.
Right. So Abby, what can you add to this? What would be some of the difficulties that somebody encounters?
I mean, clearly there are a lot of difficulties if only maybe 100 folks have applied for a pardon, right? Mm-hmm. Caryma, correct me if I'm wrong, is there a fee associated with applying for a pardon as well?
So the fee for like the regular processing fee was waived. That was kind of the main concession. We're doing this for free, but because of the steps involved in the process, getting your fingerprints, getting copy of the physical documents that were filed with the court, getting your police records, there are all sorts of ancillary expenses that are part and parcel of this. So it's not, strictly speaking, a free process. And the actual headache of running around, especially if the charge is somewhat dated, or if it happened, that one time I was passing through Winnipeg or whatever, there might just be practical obstacles to getting that done.
So how easy is it to have your cannabis record suspended?
I've actually not found someone who wants me to take them through the process yet. So again, that speaks to how few are, or how few people are eligible. I mean, the pardon process overall, I think, is a little bit sort of paperwork heavy and obtaining documents heavy, but otherwise a step-by-step thing. So it's doable, especially if someone has assistance, but it's also like there's a lot of time and resource investment, let's put it that way.
What is the length of time to get it suspended?
Right now, because of COVID, I'm actually not sure. And like I said, I've not been through the process. I believe it takes a minimum of 6 months, but I am just making an educated guess, to be honest.
Okay. Anything else you guys want to touch in on that one? Are you guys good?
Yeah, I got one more comment. I just thinking about the low numbers. I think this is an educated guess as well, but a large part of it must be the fact that the communities that would benefit the most from this don't necessarily know. Like, we don't know that for sure, right? Do they watch the 6 o'clock news necessarily when Bill Blair walks out and says, "Hey, we've waived the," I think there needs to be a more targeted sort of campaign to if this is an altruistic, it should be a thing where it's okay. We know who you are. We're going to notify you that this is what's happening. Here are the steps for you to do that. In my view, that should be the line.
Now, would it be fair to say, like, is there, like, say somebody has a conviction and they're thinking about taking this avenue, or even so, a bigger concern, what can people do? Because you guys are saying that there's only been 100 applications, correct?
It was something like that a couple of months ago, and I don't think I don't think the needle would have changed a lot during COVID.
Right. So this is possibly due to the difficulties of going through the process. And if so, what can just the average citizen, even somebody with a criminal record or their parents, what avenue do they have to make a change in this policy?
One effective option is signing on to petitions or campaigns that are already in existence, being run by people who are familiar with these issues, kind of doing the legwork of liaising with politicians, etc., and asking for kind of messaging or sound bites or checking out their website, placing your own call to your MP, or those are, I think, some of the immediate steps that one can take.
Now, it sounds like this is super discouraging, seeing as how there's so few attempts at actually going through the process. I remember seeing it on the news when the government said that the process was free. So what actually is free? What are they giving up to make this process easier?
Normally, to process a pardon, there's a fee that's in the vicinity of $700.
Okay.
So that fee has been waived. Yeah, it's the rest of the steps that you might still be charged along the way, depending on the situation.
All right. So is it fair to say that certain communities are more affected by previous cannabis laws and present day reform than others?
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead, Abs. Go ahead.
Yes. Short answer, yes. Yes, it is absolutely fair to say that certain communities are more affected than others. We see it on the news, even during COVID, while rich white men are opening up the TSX with their new catchy cannabis ticker. Just last year, an Indigenous man in Winnipeg got 10 months in jail for 3 ounces of cannabis. Like, now that we're all home staring at our phone, we see like white influencers bopping around on Instagram, like doing dabs to Lizzo. While, as Ish said, Black and brown folks are still in jail. So yes, it is fair to say that certain communities are more affected than others.
Ish, you want to jump on that one?
Yeah, sure. I'll just add a little bit. I think there's the part of the challenge is there's this view, you mentioned, white influencers. There's this view that, because it's good and legal now, that it's fine, like we mentioned earlier. But if you did it before, why'd you do it? It was illegal, kind of thing, right? So that is the attitude. So that's part of it. That's part of the disconnect. And in light of sort of what's happening in the world right now, that's become more clear. And what I'm finding is that just generally, if I have some to be optimistic and have some faith, there's this disconnect in the way we think about each other. And that's part of it. And that goes from, as you mentioned, the influencer all the way up into the boardroom, right? And that type of thinking is part of the problem. And if that thinking could be, changed, or if there were, enough people that had the right frame of reference at the table, we could actually solve these problems. For example, like I oversimplified it regarding the pardon, saying just, send out this, but like even something as small as, the communities that were over policed, workshops, make it known, let it be known that this is something. And if there's anyone watching from an LP that's interested in doing a project like that, I'm all ears. You can holler at me, because I care about impact. So that was organic.
Yeah, it's all good. It's nothing but love here. We have more COVID patients than ever before. So now that you guys have touched on it, let's this racial divide, or where majority of these charges are laid. Now, is it because of stigma and of the certain areas or the certain group of people that are being targeted by a majority of the charges? Like yesterday, I was looking at some information posted from Colorado, something about 2016, that from their legalization, when they opened up dispensaries, cannabis crimes were down 8% for whites. It was up 25% for Hispanic, and it was up 58% for Black Americans. Are we facing the same here in Canada?
I think we do risk repeating some of the same issues, just in the way that penalties are now structured. And I mentioned earlier officer discretion and how that has been a problem in the past. It's the difference between a police officer stumbling upon a group of teenagers in a park and giving them, a bit of a scolding, or taking them home to their parents and saying, "Don't let me find you here again," versus roughing them up, searching their bags, detaining them at the station, maybe holding them for a bail hearing. Maybe they plead guilty because they don't really have the resources for a lawyer and maybe don't qualify for legal aid. And suddenly the same situation has two drastically different outcomes. One person who now has a funny anecdote to share about that time they encountered police, and someone else who will have restricted job opportunities, might affect a scholarship. It could crop up in a future family court litigation issue about child custody. All of these repercussions that, we're talking about the same issue. And that's not fixed by the new rules, and the fact that officers will still have a degree of discretion. And discretion is a good thing when it's applied fairly and evenly, irrespective of who is being detained. But it becomes a very dangerous weapon otherwise. And I think one of the significant changes post-legalization is the Impaired Driving Act, that in many ways expands police powers, and it criminalizes cannabis use in quite an arbitrary way, because it doesn't actually test impairment. It's testing something different, and it's not accounting for how often someone consumes, whether they're a medical patient, what their reaction to cannabis is. And it also, in some situations, removes the need for there to be a reasonable suspicion to pull someone over in the first place. And so you take all of that combined and the pattern of past policing, and we expect that we're going to see this have a disproportionate impact on poor communities and on racialized communities. So we know kind of what the problems are. We have some of the numbers, not all, because police don't love collecting race-based data. I wonder why. but you know, we risk perpetuating the same problems.
All right, so then,
Well, I was going to say, Caryma, like, why collect race-based data when all lives matter?
beautifully said. That is, and I'm not even kidding with you. I had this discussion just the other day about Black Lives Matter, and we had to interject and say all lives matter. So let me jump here. What should be done in present day to help communities that were targeted by the war on drugs, now seeing a post-legalization era, that they've more or less been shut out of? Abs?
You know what, I was when I was looking at this question, I actually wanted to kind of maybe give some insights to what the industry can do in order to welcome more players in the legalized space. I think all of the speakers, all of the panelists have been saying that there are folks who aren't necessarily shut out of the legal industry, but we all know there are so many barriers in entering. It's expensive. There's all sorts of barriers that that folks can experience. If we look at places like San Francisco, they have an Office of Cannabis. You know, they have equity programs that are far from perfect, but equity applicants do have certain benefits. You know, when they go through this process, you know, they don't need to pay the $5,000 permit fee required to open up a cannabis retail shop, and applicants can also benefit from like their equity incubators, which provide like rent-free space for 3 years, or like technical assistance to start a business. So like business planning, writing, or budgeting, things like, you know, tangible knowledge, skills that some folks might not have. I really want to see the industry lobbying for those things. You know, like, I mean, if we all agree that cannabis is a product that exists for the health and well-being of individuals, of folks who choose to use it, if we can all agree that cannabis criminalization is deeply rooted in racism, if we can all agree that Black and brown people are disproportionately targeted or affected by past and current cannabis legalization and frameworks, why aren't we all kind of advocating for the same thing, right? So I'd love to see more engagement from the industry on that end. And yeah, like, I mean, Canada is the first G7 country to legalize cannabis. So these are steps that should be taken like at the federal level, because it's kind of a big deal.
It is.
Yeah, and you know what? There's so many places where lobbying is needed. You know, like at the municipal level, especially at the provincial level. And I mean, if the industry is so willing to lobby for like farm gate, I think an equitable industry is something that they should also be lobbying for. And then of course, just kind of like from like a kind of like a like ground level, just allocating resources, like you know, giving money to those organizations that are doing the work in these communities that are impacted, you know. But that's my 2 cents on that.
Your 2 cents has a long range that actually would open up another panel or two. Ish, what should be done in present day to help communities that were targeted by the war on drugs and now seeing post-legalization era, they've more or less been shut out? Hit me with some.
Okay, I'll give you some tangible things. I think one tangible thing could be, I know there are a lot of programs that the government likes to use where they'll take people that are on social assistance and train them. And there's organizations that can train them in construction, for example. So they have this path into the trades. And so that's great, it's noble. And there are some success stories out of that, right? I think as with cannabis as this emerging industry, maybe that could be a vehicle to connect licensed producers with folks that have been, shut out historically, with, like an actual concrete, because these, these programs are concrete. It's, you're committing to, however, maybe it's a 2-month program where you're learning, you're teaching, and ultimately by the end of that, ideally you've learned X and you're doing this job in the cannabis industry with, and that's a start, right? And that would be a start that's sort of kind of, a Band-Aid, I guess. But it's a start, and I'd like to give tangible things I can do. And then, show me a large cannabis producer that has a Black person on the board of directors. And I would, that would help me, sort of speak truth to that.
Okay.
Yeah.
When I said hit him hard, you weren't joking.
I just keep it real, my man. I think that's what we all need to do, right? And so that's important. Let's just keep it real. And if we are keeping it real, we can solve problems if everyone's keeping it real.
Well, that's definitely why the three of yous are here, because you all three are quite prevalent in the online space, and you guys really speak from your heart, and you guys wear your hearts on your shoulders, and you guys are doing big things. So there's some troubling things obviously going on inside the cannabis industry. I've even seen Jody Emery's posts that are very political, where she points out about policymakers and law enforcement getting inside of the cannabis industry. So do you think it was fair police and policymakers who systematically targeted cannabis crimes were then able to become stakeholders and profit in this industry?
No, the answer to that is no. I think it's pretty despicable. I think it is shocking that we sort of step back and that was a thing that manifested. And in fact, ex-cops and politicians hold very dominant positions in the industry. And I, speaking as a defense lawyer, am very much for the idea of someone coming to terms with actions and making changes and, revisiting previous decisions and becoming better people. I think that that is great and laudable, but that has to come with some form of accountability. And that step was missing. And there have been no reparations for people affected by the war on drugs. There's been no meaningful apology from these people who made their living criminalizing cannabis users. And to turn around and then be first in line to profit, I think, reveals sort of a moral failing and a bankruptcy there. And the real priority should be, I guess, putting people who were hurt by these activities or the criminalization, ensuring that they actually have more of a stake in the industry.
Abby.
I agree 100%, Caryma. I think we only need to kind of look at the state of the world to see just how unfair a lot of things are, right? So the question is it fair? No, it's not. Sometimes I have no words, so I'll just echo what Caryma said. There are folks who have been violently harmed by cannabis prohibition, who deserve to have a seat at the table. And there are folks who were violent in enacting cannabis prohibition, and there has been there's been no accountability. And call me a hopeless optimistic, but that to me does not embody the spirit of cannabis. To me, cannabis embodies like community and caring and compassion and healing. And, there are people who inflicted pain, and not even just, the act, the act of being arrested and prosecuted, but like all of the domino effects of that, my heart.
It's a touchy subject, but I'm going to play the devil's advocate here before leaving this question. And I'm going to say, okay, being on the opposite side, whether a politician or whether a law enforcement, they're going to say they stepped away from their professional position to become a public citizen. So why should they not be able to take advantage of what is on the table?
Well, you know, at that point, oh, go ahead.
Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer to that is it's not that they're not allowed to. I think what's legal and what's moral they never correlate, right? Slavery was legal. Jim Crow laws were legal. And so I for me, none of this it's not super surprising because power corrupts, and when you have power with just a small group subset of people, you know, how did, you know, sort of cannabis legalization get through, right? It was a fight. What were the steps? Who was involved? It was sort of, you know, a foregone conclusion that, like, who was in the know? The people close to it. And so, yeah, it's, you know, morally, if you're going to say that, you know, these people are terrible for selling a little bit of weed, and you're like, oh, I got this epiphany. We are going to, like, you know, grow a bunch of weed, like by the tons. And now that's totally cool. But I don't even think about personally as the person that did that. Like, listen, if Julian Fantino and Bill Blair were like, hey, listen, that, you know, we change your mind, we effed up, we're gonna fight to make sure that the people that we screwed over are gonna have a seat at the table and some sort of, you know, reconciliation, then you know what? I might be like, you know, go on with your bad self, Julian Fantino, getting into the cannabis game. I might.
So in a perfect world, how would you like to see cannabis convictions handled?
I think that, you know, in a perfect world, it would actually be the government reviewing its files and doing this automatically, not leaving it up to the individual citizen to fill out a bunch of paperwork, and hopefully you do that right and go collect the necessary documents and we'll process it for you. I think that there's got to be a simpler way to do that, and it should be an automatic thing.
Abs?
I agree. I mean, I know that a lot of the kind of the arguments against kind of an automatic expungement is that a lot of cannabis convictions are marked down as like drug convictions. So there's like a little bit of muddling as to who is eligible. Is that right, Caryma? Like, is that one of the arguments that they're saying? It's like, yes. No, and
a lot of records aren't digitized on top of that.
So it's almost like hopeless. What does the average citizen do? It seems, okay, very costly to apply for a pardon. It seems very tedious for the fact that you have to track down your criminal record. You have to get your fingerprints done. I'm not sure the remaining amount of paperwork that's done. It seems like such a hopeless affair.
And I don't want to give people that impression. So if we've
give me some hope. Give me hope.
I think, I mean, Abby's talked about some of the stuff industry can do. As far as what we can call on our leaders to do, I think the notion of how funds are allocated, that's an important question. And with legalization came an increase, not a decrease, an increase to police budgets because they had new cannabis laws to enforce and needed new equipment, and that is counterproductive. So seeing that money redirected to communities, to social services, to programs like Ish mentioned, you know, targeting workshops because you know which areas you were over policing. So there's got to be a way to get information to them now after the fact. That's stuff we can call for, and at the local level, hold our local leaders accountable. And, you know, we build out from there.
I like it. So I've got one more question before we can get into a Q&A. So if the audience has any questions for any one of the panelists, they can definitely chime in. Just send us a message and we'll get the questions out to the panel. But before we do that, Ish, did you want to touch on that?
No, I think they did quite a perfect
Next
job.
question.
Absolutely.
I agree. I definitely agree. And it's sad that we can't have the perfect world. It seems very hopeless. There's a lot of people out there with so many unnecessary criminal records with under 30 grams charges. So
wait, I'll add. Yeah.
Perfectly.
So I actually, now that I think about it, my conviction is in the States, in Pennsylvania. But had it been here, like I wouldn't be eligible for a pardon, right? And I just got into law school, right? So, but I wouldn't be eligible for a pardon, which is, you know, it's like the law is basically the same. Like, what's this arbitrary, like, you know, it just, again, it just doesn't, you know, make sense. And I don't think it's hopeless. I think, you know, the right advocate with a seat at the table and can make some change.
Right.
And so I think it's possible because to be quite honest with you, a lot of it is just having, you know, more of the right people in the room to just get the discussion even going in a meaningful way. And I say this may take, you know, a few trailblazers to make this happen. But ultimately it's, you know, to get people to understand that, like, you know, they're not just Black people from whatever neighborhood, right? Like there's more to it than that, because, you know, they've been criminalized. There's the stigma that, you know, that is, you know, thought of around, you know, certain neighborhoods, certain ethnicities, all the things, right? All these intersectional things that happen. And it's just the way that it's a way of thinking that I think we all should.
Are there any organizations our viewers can work with to influence change?
Shameless plug for NORML Canada.
I want all the shameless plugs. Never mind. We're trying to help the audience. We're trying to help people. I think we should do another panel on how to inspire people to be able to get this process to way more than 100. If that is the better route, or maybe we can lead people to amnesty cannabis, right? To be able to expunge these charges, or at least find an avenue that we can take to charter down that road to expungement, which seems to be the right, how do I say, would be the right choice. So give me the shameless plugs, guys. Spit them out. Where can people get help?
Cannabis Amnesty is a great organization. They actually were one of the, they're the first organization that I shared my story publicly, and they're doing great work. I think there are, from like my perspective, the work that I'm doing with, you know, Legalish, you know, I'm out there just doing my best to help people sort of navigate the criminal justice system generally. But, you know, having this conversation, I've thought about it, and I think part of what's needed is like a connector to the communities. And I think that that is something that, you know, with some of these ideas, like the workshops, whatever it is, you know, once, you know, COVID allows us to, you know, take our lives back to normal, I think that is something tangible, you know, we can do. Like just sitting here with the three of you, that is something that, you know, literally we could go, I could figure it out, and we could we could try it in a community, right? And we can probably get these things done, because I'm applying for a pardon that's even more arduous right now. And I've gotten that down pat. I need like 50 recommendations and all these things. So I'm applying for a pardon in Pennsylvania to get my pot conviction removed, which So this is the States. I'm, again, and this is why I say having the right people in the room matters. Until the current administration, I had thought about applying for a pardon in PA, but it was going to take like 2.5 to 5 years, and there wasn't really any help. And so they actually hired a secretary of the Board of Pardons. His name's Brandon Flood, and his job was to modernize the pardons. And what was one of the first things he did? He has an expedited path for people with nonviolent pot convictions. It doesn't matter how much weed it was, expedited path. We're going to get you through. And like a pardon is it's actually not there. It is like a legit, pardon. And that process has been pretty arduous. And I've looked at the pardon application. It's not super difficult in of itself. It's the pieces, right? Like we have to understand that, the ability to go get fingerprints and whatever it is, like it may seem like a small amount of money to some, but it's a lot. And you're balancing between, are you going to pay for this or that? Or also, what's the end result for me? Is this pardon going to open up particular doors? I don't know, right? So I think there needs to be a more clear sort of advocacy communication piece. Clearly, all of y'all got advocacy down pat. And so maybe we can do something. I'm trying to inject some positivity into this, right?
Definitely. Ab, shameless plugs.
You know what? Shameless plugs. If we're talking about what, okay, so I guess I'll back up a little bit. Absolutely, NORML Canada, absolutely, Cannabis Amnesty. They're wonderful Canadian organizations that folks can get involved with, follow their work, donate to these organizations. But when I think of where I want the industry to go or what the industry can do to advocate for change at that level, I don't think of an organization, but I think of an individual. Her name is Nina Parks. She's out in San Francisco. She's an expert in cannabis policy, social equity. Her story is that, she is a woman of color. Her brother got busted for cannabis trafficking. She had to kind of take over, the family business, but of course, just kind of shows up at every single city council meeting, shows up at every single time cannabis can be brought to the table. She is there, and she's Madam Chair of the Cannabis Equity Program out there. So I would definitely if you want to talk about inspiration, if you want to talk about one person making waves, Nina Parks is someone to look for. So yeah, that's my shameless plug.
Perfect. Caryma?
Like I said, NORML Canada has some interesting initiatives on the go. We are really working to promote the diversity, inclusion, equity within the cannabis community and the industry specifically. So look out for some sort of connections that we'll be putting out there and some programming. And we are bringing out a newsletter, which hopefully is going to be a way in this time for sort of everyone's physically separated, but there's more information sharing now than ever. So I think that's a good way to stay tuned and plug to the community. We're active on Twitter and Facebook, so follow us there, and that's NORML, NORML Canada.
Excellent. I definitely want to thank all three of you guys for answering the questions. Yeah, go ahead, Bish.
It's a shameless plug. I didn't hear the shameless part.
Of course, sir.
So I would love to encourage all you folks to check out legalish.ca. So that's my website. It's a brand I created to get into law school. It's evolved into I speak, I write, and I mentor. But the big next step is I'm going to law school. And law school costs a lot of money. So if you go to legalish.ca, at the top, there's a banner. If you want to support my GoFundMe to pay for this $120K to get to finish law school, I totally appreciate it. That's my shameless plug.
Anyone who posted a black square on social media, go give Ish at least $5. Let's go.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well said. And let me just reiterate, they're definitely not shameless plugs. These are highly valued bits of information from some serious professionals. I appreciate that you guys shared that. But now we are going to get into question number one. So, are you aware of any lobbying efforts in Canada for equity programs that give targeted communities access to the industry, like what is happening in some states?
Yeah, I'm not aware of anything that's currently on the go. I think that would be sort of great fodder for a scholarship of some sort.
Question number two. Does anyone have insight into the process and complications around poor record keeping and how the change was recorded? Example, there used to be charges placed under two potential CDSA sections 1, general 1, specific. I'm trying to understand from an advocate standpoint how to spend energy and practical resources.
That's a very specific question that I don't know what the exact to. What I can say, and I guess this is kind of related. I know that in some instances, charges were so old that by accessing the pardon regime, you actually revived something that was dormant in a filing cabinet for 25 years. And that subsequently led to issues crossing the border because it then became digitized. So I would say that as an advocate, kind of, I guess that's something you want to canvass with very dated charges and consider, is getting a pardon potentially going to worsen scenarios, which, you know, shouldn't be the case, but is something that surprised me. So I share it with anyone who is a viewer.
Question number three. Do you think we can utilize momentum from Black Lives Matter right now to further the legal reform lobbying here in Canada, since a lot of the issues were systematic?
I don't know if it's right to sort of capitalize on that momentum. I think that there's definitely overlap, and there are some areas where issues clearly align, and where it makes sense to sort of highlight those policy problems or potential solutions because it's relevant to the topic at hand. But I don't know that sort of this is a moment to kind of create a new kind of cannabis campaign, if that makes sense.
I agree. I think of brands putting up rainbows at this time of the year, right? It's I mean, if the issues pertaining to Black and brown communities in the cannabis were relevant or were kind of front of mind in the cannabis space, I feel like they would have already been in the forefront, right? It's I don't know. Sorry. I have a flash of all these black squares on my Instagram right now. It's that's kind of what I think about with this question. Like everyone, yeah.
It's very touchy. It's affected all of us in some ways. I myself have been kind of quiet. I really haven't said too much about it. It's very hard. It's very hard to take. We've seen this from 1991 all the way up until today, and a lot of us know what's been happening in between. Nothing. It's still the exact same thing. So it's very hard to want to pour your heart out and inject some action into this. That being said, let me get into, I believe it's our fourth question here. If there are to do 11K pardons in Illinois, it would seem that it wouldn't be impossible to do it elsewhere. Is there something significantly different about their state system than our federal system that makes a similar move not feasible here? Did that make sense to you guys?
I think I understand the question, and it's comparing sort of Canada's regime to what's happening, I guess, in Illinois. And I wasn't aware of the 11,000 pardons, and I actually don't know enough about how their state works to say whether it's comparable or not. It seems that part of the issue here is records not being digitized, and as one question alluded to, and Abby mentioned, you know, it may not be evident what is cannabis versus something else, and so it's easier just to kind of pass the buck on that. That's my best guess as to why that there's such a big difference in numbers.
Ish, you want to touch on this one?
Sure. I mean, if I had to guess, I'm just gonna guess like Caryma. If I had to guess, like I don't know what the regime is in Illinois, but it all goes back to to leadership. So if it's important, it sounds like it was important to someone in Illinois that had some power, and so this is why it's happening. There's results when you put resources behind it. That's just a guess.
No, it's good. It makes it kind of clear. Question number 5. Are there still people in Canada in jail for cannabis crimes?
I haven't been able to source numbers on it. Making another educated guess, if there are people, I would imagine that those cannabis crimes were accompanied by other charges as well. So I am skeptical that there's anyone currently in jail for like having a joint, for example, but if your trafficking charge also came with an attempted murder, yes, you might be in jail. But I don't have a clear sense of the numbers. I know that today there was a prisoner in, I think it was Kentucky, who died with 2 years left on his sentence, and he was in jail for weed-related offenses, and it was COVID-19. So for sure it's happening in the States, but they had just a different political and legal context for mass incarceration. Not to say it's not happening here, but that's my sense of the numbers.
Okay. Ish, would you guys like to touch on this? It's the last question for the night.
Sure. So I'm not sure about the numbers in Canada. That's actually a project that I've put on the list, and because it's a number that's important to know, right? Because having the data, we can then say what do we throw at it, right? But in the States, 100%, there's people that are going to die as in federal prison for pot charges. Like right as of today, there's people sitting in federal prison that, but for a pardon, as far as statute is concerned, they are destined to die in a prison for, I don't care if it was a truckload of pot, right? And that's really what sort of really disheartening to me. And beyond that, right, if you want to, speak even further, there are a lot of Black women that are incarcerated federally in the United States that are, got what we call football numbers, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 years or life for what's called that conspiracy charge, right? So they're just involved a little bit, right? And so that, it's that, like, I mean, it's the United States, it's not Canada, but it's there, and that's what sort of keeps the advocacy going, right? Because that is just, to me, fundamentally unfair. I mean, I let them out. I mean, and there are lots of cases where it's literally just weed, right? And it's a weed plus conspiracy charge because you're part of a weed ring. What's a weed ring? Is a weed ring like like that's like basically like the old word for an LP, I guess. I don't know.
Wow. Here, I've got one more that's popped up. This question: do you guys like the Last Prisoner Project? Have you guys heard of the Last Prisoner Project?
I have no idea. I don't know.
No?
Is that here in Canada or?
The Last Prisoner Project is in the United States, where they are fighting for criminals in jail. If you want to touch on this, Caryma, jump in.
Yeah, I've been following that campaign on social media, and I think, I mean, I have nothing but good things to say about that concept. I don't know specifically the workings behind the scenes, but I do know that, there is the notion that someone will be the last person in jail on a cannabis offense. And the sooner we get to that person and find them and uncage them, the cleaner our conscience will be. And I think that that's important for anyone who's looking to profit off of this industry, whether directly or through an ancillary business.
Excellent. Ab, do you want to get the last word in?
You know what, I agree with Caryma, and I think that, folks who, industry players specifically, I want to maybe shamelessly plug Ish, because here you have a resource who is willing to get the numbers, get the data. That's the information that we need, right? In order to really make impactful change. I feel, I know that there are a lot of CSR, a lot of corporate social responsibility folks on the line. And I'll just kind of repeat my personal mantra on cannabis. I truly believe it's here for, embodies compassion, caring, community. And we're kind of at this really interesting point in history now where we've actually been given the opportunity to stop and pause and look at what it is that we're doing.
Preach.
Normally, thanks. Normally, this is the time of the year when a lot of LPs will be hyping up their Pride events. Not just rainbowing their logos, but there's a lot of community engagement happening at this time of year that's not really happening. It's a time to really reflect on what kind of industry we want to be going forward. So yeah, Ish, legalish.ca, is that it, Ish? Yeah.
Legalish.ca. Love it.
Ish, you good?
I'm great. This has been awesome.
Okay, so before I let you guys go, I definitely want to drop a few last words. A special thank you for all of you taking the time to be here to give out this information. I definitely believe we need to have number 2 and spit some fire, because you guys brought up and touched on some very important subjects that would have brought us out of the scope of what we were talking about today. And I didn't want to stray away too far, because you guys are a vast well of information. But I believe that we should get together for a second part, maybe dig down a little bit deeper. Let's get a little harder with the divide between the races, this targeted approach, other means that the people can do. So I just want to say this. The Campaign for Cannabis Amnesty is a nonpartisan, non-for-profit group composed of lawyers, advocates, and entrepreneurs, brought together by the behalf that the harms caused by decades of marijuana prohibition must be made right. We started an online petition platform and successfully lobbied the federal government to pass legalization, to provide expedited pardons to those convicted of cannabis possession offenses. We have developed education and advocacy resources and work in partnership with industry to help Canadians across the country learn more about the harms caused by cannabis criminalization and what we can do to create a more fair and just national framework for cannabis legalization. For my panel guests, I would like you guys to let people know where they can get hold of you online, your social media. So we'll start with Caryma. Go ahead. You can let people know where they can find you.
Thank you. I am on Twitter at Caryma Rules. So that's CARYMARULES. And you can find NORML Canada on Twitter as well, NORML Canada. I'm also on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn, and you can find NORML on those platforms too.
Perfect. Abs.
I am Heidi, HIHEIDIHIGH. Yeah, Heidi on Instagram and Twitter. You can find me going off about all sorts of things on those platforms. You can also find Niche Canada on nichecanada.ca.
Beautiful. Ish.
Sure, yeah. So I'm going to make this real easy for y'all. So legalish.ca, right under the banner after you donate, there's a strip of all my social media things. You can find it all. But Twitter, legalish.ca, Instagram, legalish.ca. You can find the LinkedIn and all the other good things on that right-hand corner, just below the donate banner.
Excellent. To the audience that took part in this panel, I'd like to thank all of you guys. I thank you for the questions for the panel. The panel definitely thanks you guys for the questions and taking part. These guys are professionals. They have very important information to share with everybody. Like I said, hopefully we'll get together very soon and we'll get part 2 out there and we'll get a little more grimier into what's going on. So for Ish, Caryma, Abs, guys, thank you very much.
Thank
you all. Thank you.
And
Thanks
you
everyone.
guys stay safe and everybody keep up washing your hands.
Take care. Take care. Bye, everyone.
Bye.